Welcome, folklorists. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I am your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast, Fabric of Folklore, where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And what makes folklore so awesome is that our world is so full of mystery. And one of the ways that we fill the gaps is through story. Our stories, our oral traditions, our rituals are not without meaning. They help us to connect to that which we wish to better understand. And this podcast is about understanding the importance, significance, and its context, which in turn helps us to understand our own motivations and our own cultural traditions as well as others. It's easier to remove those judgment lenses, those critical glasses, once we've viewed our own culture through quirks, through the lens of strangers' eyes. So if that sounds like a podcast that you are interested in listening to, please hit that subscribe button, whether that's on your YouTube channel or if you're listening on a podcasting streaming. Make sure you subscribe today so you are able to get notifications for when our podcasts come out every Tuesday. Morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So today we have a fantastic guest. Francis Young is a UK-based historian and folklorist specializing in the history of religion and belief. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of 20 books which deal with subjects as diverse as early modern Catholicism, the history of exorcism, medieval monasticism.
Monasticism.
Is that how you say that word? Monasticism. Okay. Folklore, the cult of saints, the history of magic and witchcraft, and Baltic paganism. He is also a professional indexer and a translator specializing in medieval and early modern Latin. So welcome, Francis. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I really like to get started helping our guests to understand the context of helping our audience to understand the context of our guests. So can you give us a little bit of your journey into how you fell into this folkloric journey or historian journey?
Yeah, well, my PhD was in more conventional areas, I suppose, of the history of religion. But it deviated off into looking at supernatural belief. And I came to realize that I'm interested really in belief in general. I can't restrict what I'm interested in just to what might be considered religious history or church history. And I'm particularly interested, what really draws me are beliefs that other people tend to consider to be outdated or obscure or absurd or superstitious or things that are a bit out there and tend to be rejected as part of an older belief system. And so whereas I started really by looking at Catholicism in England after the Reformation, I've expanded out to look at other faiths which kind of continued under the surface of other societies. And so hence my interest in paganism in the Baltic area, for example.
And why do you think that drew your
Well, I have
interest?
a long-standing connection with Lithuania in particular. I spent quite a bit of time there when I was a student and had lots of Lithuanian friends and learnt some of the Lithuanian language, not as much as I should have liked. It's a region which I already had a connection with. And so as I kind of became drawn into looking at these questions of what remains of paganism in that sort of early modern period, then really I was drawn to that region, and because it's well known. You know, if you speak to Lithuanian people, they will often say to you, my country was the last in Europe to be converted to Christianity. It was the last pagan nation. And so it's very much a part of that heritage. But I think it is true too of Latvia and Estonia, the other Baltic nations.
And so Let's go back real quick. Why were you in Lithuania
Well,
as a
I was
student?
really interested in Lithuania. I had contacts that I made of people that I'd met in the UK who said, "Well, come back to Lithuania, come and see what it's like."
Uh-huh.
And so I ended up doing that. And so really, yes, it sort of all happened by
Oh.
accident. But what it did was it established a kind of connection with that country.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I noticed that in your books that you've written, there's quite a large diversity of topics that you look at. Is there like a common core, or is there kind of like how you learn about something and then it piques your interest in something else, or how does that diversity of topics
Yes, there
fall?
is a common thread, and I think that it is very much as you say. It's kind of, I write about one thing, and that stimulates me then to get interested in something else and write about that. And yeah, I think the common thread is an interest in supernatural belief, and particularly in supernatural beliefs that are
Hmm.
rejected or considered strange. So this is what draws me to,
Hmm.
for example, exorcism, belief in magic, belief in witchcraft, belief in fairies, these things which there's a long history of people and scholars scoffing at these things rather than actually studying them, and so that's what interests me. But also, also paganism, because again, that's something which there's a long history of that being treated as an anomaly. People say, paganism survived in the Baltic for longer than elsewhere in Europe. Therefore, it's treated as this kind of relic that lingered on. It's not kind of given any agency. It's not considered to be something which had any value in itself. It
Hmm.
only has value insofar as, Christianity is then allowed to replace it. So, yeah, I wanted to sort of give a voice to believers who might not
Mm.
otherwise have any kind of voice.
And can you recall reading a topic and saying, oh, that's really strange? Like one of the very first things that really piqued your interest in when you were doing your, you know, research. What was one of the very first things that you were like, oh, wow, that's strange. I want to learn more about
I
that.
think, yeah, what really drew me back to putting my attention back on Lithuania, when I was originally in Lithuania, I wasn't particularly focused or interested in paganism. I wasn't particularly interested in ancient Lithuanian history. But what really drew my focus back to it was I was asked to write a piece a few years ago about this question, which is often discussed among academics in the UK, about pagan survivals. To what extent can we say that in the Middle Ages there were elements of paganism that were surviving into people's ordinary lives? And what I noticed was that nearly everything that had been written about this was focused on the UK or focused on Ireland, or possibly it might go as far afield as
Mhm.
France. And this sort of made me a bit cross because I thought, well, actually, that you do realize that there were people who consciously identified as pagan in medieval Europe. They just weren't in the places that you want to read about. So they were people in Eastern Europe. And so that
Mhm.
sort of made me think, well, actually, am I in a position here to increased knowledge of this region? Because I had been there, because I had this connection there, because I knew some of the language. And so I thought, well, maybe this is something that I should turn to, and that I should, try and increase knowledge about this region. And that was what really
Mhm.
produced that book eventually, that came out last year, Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, which is an attempt to translate some of the key sources from the sort of 15th and 16th centuries and make these available for the first time to an English speaking audience.
Mhm. And how far did paganism stretch?
Well, it depends what period you're talking about. I mean, if we're talking about Eastern Europe generally, there are early adopters of Christianity. So
Mhm.
the Poles are early adopters of Christianity, and of course the Slavs, the East Slavs. So those countries that we would now know as Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, they are fairly early adopters of Orthodox Christianity. But between those countries, there are large swathes of pagan territory. One group of pagans are the West Slavs. That is to say, they're sometimes referred to as the Palabian Slavs, sometimes referred to as the Wends. They occupied an area which is now partly in the territory of Poland, partly in what's now Eastern Germany. And they essentially they essentially become the subject of a crusade, and as a result of that, Germans take over their lands, and cities such as Leipzig spring up and take over those people. But then you've got people like the Prussians. So the Balts, that is to say, people who are ethnically Baltic, they are the Prussians who live in an area which is now the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, what used to be the old German kingdom of Prussia, but was originally a Baltic kingdom. You've got the Lithuanians, you've got the Latvians, and you've got various now extinct peoples like the Yotvingians and the Sudovians. And all these people are pagan until a fairly late date, certainly into the 13th century. And then you've got a Finnic people, the Estonians. The Estonians are a Finnic people because they're related to the Finns. They don't speak a Baltic language. We talk today about Estonia as a Baltic state, but that's a geographical designation. It's not actually an ethnic or linguistic designation. But all these countries are pagan to a late date. However, various crusading orders take over what's now Kaliningrad, so that Prussian area. They take over what's now Latvia and Estonia, which is then called Livonia. And the one country that holds out, the one country that refuses to adopt Christianity consistently, is Lithuania. So Lithuania at this point is an absolutely massive country, much, much bigger than it is today. So it's what's now the territory of the Republic of Lithuania, plus Belarus, plus large parts of what's now Ukraine, and also significant parts of what's now Western Russia. So it's the largest country in Europe by far in the late Middle Ages. And it is officially pagan, although a lot of the population are also Orthodox Christians. But the Grand Dukes of Lithuania are officially pagan, and they remain so until the late 14th century. So it is true to say that it's the last state in Europe to be converted to Christianity.
And how did that conversion happen? How did it
That's a really
occur?
good question. And it is a fascinating example of conversion, because most conversions in this region take place as a result of military force. This one doesn't. And it's, in fact, a power play, a political power play by one of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania called Jogaila. That's his Lithuanian name, although he's better known to history as Władysław II Jagiełło, which is his Polish name. And he becomes the progenitor of the Jagiellonian dynasty, a great dynasty of Polish and Lithuanian kings. But Jogaila essentially finds himself in a position where he's caught between great powers on either side of him. So he's got the Orthodox Principality of Muscovy. So that's the state that eventually develops into Russia, but at this point it's much smaller. And that's the major Orthodox power in Northern Europe. He's got the Kingdom of Poland, which is Catholic, and he's got the Teutonic Knights, who are a monastic military order who are also Catholic, but hate the Poles, and the Poles hate them back. So there's sort of two flavors of Catholicism. And essentially, he's being pressed by the Teutonic Knights on one side, and he's being pressed by the Muscovites on the other. At one point, his mother tries to marry him to a Muscovite princess, but that doesn't follow through. The Teutonic Knights want his land. They want to take particularly one region called Samogitia away from him. He doesn't want that to happen. And so in the end, he comes to a decision that the lesser of evils is to accept an offer that's been made to him by the Poles that he should marry Jadwiga. Now, Jadwiga is the heir of the King of Poland. In fact, she is the King of Poland. She has the title of king rather than the title of queen. And if he marries Jadwiga, he has been offered the crown of Poland. And not only that, but Poland and Lithuania would enter into some kind of union, although exactly what kind of union is unclear at this point. And so he accepts this. And of course, this means that he has to get baptized, and he also has to promise that he will baptize his own nation, which he does within about 2 years. So priests are sent to Vilnius, and the Lithuanians who are there are baptized in great cohorts. So they're gathered together in a kind of square formation, and a priest will go round with a thing called an aspergillium, which is like a holy water shaker, and will shake holy water all over all these people, and they're all baptized with the same name, each person in these square formations. So it's the most kind of surface conversion you could possibly imagine. And as you can imagine, the Lithuanians don't really, as a result of that, adopt Christianity. And in fact, it's not until the late 18th century that we have real signs of Catholicism becoming something that the Lithuanians have truly internalized and have truly identify with Catholicism. Up to that point, there's lots of evidence of Lithuanians continuing to worship sacred trees, to worship sacred snakes, and so forth. So, yeah, paganism dies very, very hard in Lithuania.
So that's about 400 years, is that correct? From when they got converted to when they actually start to believe it internally?
Is the official date of the conversion. 1413 for Samogitiya. So Samogitiya is even later. But yes, I mean, if you're talking about, when we start to see real kind of force to kind of Lithuanian Catholic piety as something which is internalized, sort of mid to late 18th century. So yes, it is about 400 years that it takes. Having said that, urban areas become Christianized much earlier on, but it is these remote rural areas where people still speak Lithuanian that take a very long time to be Christianized, partly because there aren't that many priests who can speak Lithuanian. There aren't many missionaries who can speak Lithuanian. And these places are pretty hard to get to.
And do you still see remnants of pagan rituals or traditions today, or are they pretty much gone?
I think it's difficult to say. Excuse me. It's difficult to say what can really be considered a remnant of pagan ritual. There are many Lithuanian customs that continue today that have pagan origins. They have been Christianized in various ways. One good example would be, you've got a festival which is called Velinis or Ildes. This takes place late October, early November, so around the time of All Hallows Eve, All Saints, the time when in many European countries there's a kind of commemoration of the dead. In Lithuania, this is very intense. So there are practices of inviting the spirits of the dead into the home to feast with the living. There are practices of sometimes dining at the tomb of the deceased, and a real sense of the dead joining the community of the living for that one night, which is probably,
And when is that? That sounds very similar to like Day of the
Yes,
Dead.
it's sometimes referred to as the Lithuanian Day of the Dead, because I think if you want to find something of comparable intensity, I think you do need to look at Central America, at things like the Day of the Dead, it's more intense than most other things that you'll find in Europe going on at that time. So yeah, that's certainly pagan, and I think when you look at things like wood carving traditions, so there's a well-established wood carving tradition in Lithuania of pole carving, and so statues that are essentially shaped from a long thin piece of wood, a pole-like piece of wood, and they tend now to have Christian themes, but that tradition of pole carving we know is something which developed for statues of pagan gods, but it was transferred directly over to these kind of Christian symbols. And in the same way, when trees are cut down in Lithuania, it's enormously controversial. You'll have people lighting candles and holding vigils around trees that have been cut down. That's quite normal, and a reverence for nature, which I think is again is a trace of this. There are revivals of Lithuanian traditional religion. So Romova is probably the most famous example of this. I think with Romova, though, it's important to be aware that it is a revival, and it's an interpretation, and it's something which developed sort of in the 1970s as a particular approach to one way of reconstructing Baltic traditional religion. Latvia has its own version known as Dievturi. But yes, I think there are quite a lot of scholars, including myself, who would say that Romova should be treated primarily as a new religion rather than as a faithful scholarly reconstruction, as we would now understand it, of what the original Baltic religion was.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about Lithuania, because as an American, I feel like my geography of that entire region is very fuzzy. So geography, culture, history, like I know you've been telling us a bit about the history, but tell us about the people and maybe a little bit about where Lithuania is situated currently.
So contemporary Lithuania, the Republic of Lithuania, is a small country in Eastern Europe. It is located on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. So the Baltic Sea, you've got, on the western side, you've got Denmark, and to the far north, you've got Sweden and Finland. And then if you go down a bit further onto the eastern side, then you've got the three Baltic states. And the three Baltic states, the most northerly one is Estonia, closest to Finland, then going down to Latvia, and then Lithuania. So Lithuania is bordered to the north by Latvia, and to the south it's bordered by Belarus, and it's also bordered by Russia, but to the west, which is confusing because you might expect Russia to be the east, but that's because it's bordered not by the mainland of Russia, it's bordered by that exclave of Russia that used to be Prussia. So Kaliningrad Oblast, as it's known. So yeah, Lithuania doesn't have a border with mainland Russia. Lithuania, in its recent history, has been scarred by the occupation by the Soviet Union. So Lithuania declared its independence from the Russian Empire in 1918 and was an independent state between 1918 and 1940. In 1940, it was invaded by the Soviet Union. Then it was invaded under a year later by Nazi Germany, and then it was invaded again by the Soviet Union. It was occupied until 1990. In fact, longer than 1990. 1990 was when Lithuania declared its independence. Soviet troops finally withdrew in the early 1990s. But it has been an independent republic since 1990. Okay. But the thing to bear in mind about the Republic of Lithuania is that its territory is roughly corresponding to the area that's now inhabited by speakers of the Lithuanian language. So it doesn't actually correspond to what Lithuania has historically been. Historically, Lithuania was a much larger territory, as I've mentioned. So we talk about an entity called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was the Lithuania we talk about today, so the bit that speaks Lithuanian, but also the whole of Belarus and large parts of Ukraine and bits of Western Russia as well. So yeah, it's a historical accident that Lithuania has significantly shrunk in size. But on the other hand, yes, if we're talking about Lithuania as an ethnographic or a linguistic region, that does roughly correspond to the territory of the present Republic of Lithuania.
And do they only have one language in that country, or are there
multiple
languages?
So Lithuanian is by far the dominant language in today's Lithuania. Having said that, there is a very strong tradition of speaking Polish in Lithuania, in parts of Lithuania, especially in Vilnius. There are historical reasons why the Polish minority sometimes are not very well treated in Lithuania, and that goes back to the fact that a war was fought between Lithuania and Poland in the early 20th century. But yes, traditionally, there is a great deal of linguistic diversity, especially in Vilnius. So if you go back to Vilnius at the beginning of the 20th century, Vilnius was a Polish-speaking city with Lithuanian speakers, with Belarusian speakers, with Russian speakers, and most importantly, with a lot of Yiddish speakers. Vilnius was a hugely, hugely important Jewish city, the most important Jewish city of Northern Europe. Sometimes spoken of as, the Jerusalem of the North. With a massive Jewish population, and so it's impossible to talk about Lithuanian 20th century history without acknowledging that the Holocaust destroyed Lithuania's ancient Jewish community and removed that part of the country's history. So that's one of the great tragedies of 20th century Lithuanian history.
Do they still have a large Jewish
There is a small
community
Jewish
there?
community, yeah, but it's not a large one. Yeah.
But nothing like it was. What would you say sets it apart from its neighboring countries? What makes it unique? What
Well, there's
drew you
only
to
two
it?
Baltic countries in the world. That is to say, countries that are ethnically and linguistically Baltic, and that's Lithuania and Latvia. The Lithuanian and Latvian languages are quite closely related. They share a lot of vocabulary, a lot of similarities. And the Baltic languages are very popular among linguists. And the reason for that is that they are notoriously archaic. They belong to the Indo-European language group, and they preserve features of Indo-European, which a lot of linguists say can be linked back to what's known as Proto-Indo-European. So Proto-Indo-European is the hypothesized language that all of the ancestors of Indo-European languages that are spoken today. So everything from from the west of Ireland all the way through to India and Iran, and the steppes of Central Asia where Indo-European languages are spoken. They trace their origins back to steppe people who probably lived in what's now Ukraine. And so one of the first places that those steppe people might have come to is Lithuania. And it's what seems to have happened is that the people in Lithuania, the Indo-European speakers, kept their language very much intact. So yes, it has changed, but it's changed a lot less than other languages. And so there's a long tradition of linguists studying Lithuanian, even though Lithuanian only has about 3 million speakers. It's a pretty small language, globally speaking, but it's a hugely important language, and very, very well known among linguists. And there's a lot of discussion about whether, if Lithuanian preserved this language intact from a very, very early period, this very conservative, very obscure and archaic language, could it be that Lithuania also preserved beliefs, folklore, mythology that can be traced back to this Indo-European original culture? And that's a more controversial question.
Interesting. So you said the Indo-European language, is that what you were saying is one of the very first European languages? And what is so special about it? Why are linguists so interested in learning about that?
Indo-European is the supergroup, if you like, that many European languages belong to. In fact, all European languages, apart from Hungarian and Finnish and Basque. So all the other European languages belong to that. So the Germanic languages, of which English is a member, the Romance languages that spring from Latin, Greek, all of the Slavic languages, all of the languages of Eastern Europe, apart from Hungarian, they all come from Indo-European, as does Farsi, the language of Iran, and also Sanskrit and in fact Urdu and Hindi, the main languages of India. So it's a hugely important language group. And if we can therefore use Lithuanian to try and reconstruct what the original version of that language might have looked like, that makes Lithuanian very important. So that's been going on for about almost 200 years now, these attempts to kind of reconstruct the original Indo-European language based on Lithuanian.
Okay, yes, that's the quote I actually had written down that I was going to say. That was from your chapter. It should be noted, however, that the Lithuanian and Latvian nation states are the last survivors of what were once many Baltic nations and people groups stretching from the Vistula to what is now Moscow Oblast of the Russian Federation. These people spoke Indo-European languages of a notable archaic character, and some of these extinct Baltic peoples, such as Prussians and Nadruvians, survived long enough for those folklore customs to be recorded by early modern. So you basically covered that entire quote that I had written down for you to talk about. Perfect. And so, but you mentioned how they were invaded quite frequently. How were they able to prevent these influences of other languages when they had so many people coming and taking them over multiple times?
I think it's mainly a matter of geography, because what tended to happen during the Middle Ages is that the enemies of the Lithuanians, so that the Teutonic Knights, for example, they would have a summer campaign and they would come down the river Nemunas, which is an enormous river that runs down the middle of Lithuania, and they would, seize territory. But this territory is densely wooded. It's very marshy. It's impassable. It's not land which it's easy to hold on to. And in fact, there's not very much point holding on to it. And so it tended to be that the land was just impossible to hold for any length of time. And so the Lithuanians would just keep coming back and taking it back. And so, yeah, it becomes an unattractive prospect, really, for invasion.
That makes sense. Supernatural beings in Lithuania. So tell us about these fairy-like creatures.
Yes, well, Lithuania's most fairy-like creatures, I suppose, the ones that could be compared to the fairies of Northern Europe and
right, because you
Europe.
said in the book that there's lots of different versions of them, but it translates to fairy, which is sometimes accurate.
Conventionally, the word that is translated as fairy in Lithuanian is the word laume. Now, the laumes are, they have certain features that we could certainly recognize as being fairy-like. They're always female, which of course is not always true of fairies elsewhere in Europe. They are beautiful, usually beautiful, although they can also be very ugly and have features like the claws and feet of birds and so forth. But they generally appear as very beautiful young women with exaggerated features. So they're supposed to have sort of exaggeratedly large breasts, for example. And another feature that makes them very fairy-like is that they have a tendency to abduct children. They're also associated with water, with lakes and with rivers. And they're associated with hills and mounds. Again, very much fairy-like features. They are what I would describe as nature spirits, or sort of small gods of nature, in that they are, they are associated with the forest. They're associated with the outdoors. They don't, like some other spirits in Lithuanian folklore, they don't make their homes in people's houses. So they are not domestic fairies. They are very much kind of fairies of the wild. But like other fairies that we find in Europe, they have an almost exaggerated sense of justice. So they exact justice on people, which seems to be of an exaggerated character. So a classic story about the laumes is that they like helping people who are genuinely in need. And if someone is genuinely in need, particularly women, if women are spinning and they run out of wool, then they might give them additional wool to help finish their spinning. But one classic tale that is told is that a woman is jealous of another woman who's been helped by the laumes. And so she says, "Oh, laumes, help me to spin my flax." And the laumes, when she runs out of flax, they decide to use her intestines in order to finish the spinning, because she didn't really need their help, but was greedy and jealous and wanted their help. So and that kind of thing, that happens a lot in European folklore. If you mess with the fairies when you don't need to, if you make a request of them and you don't really deserve their help, then woe betide you. Something really bad is going to happen to you in that situation. But they're not generally nasty. So when they abduct children, it's because they really, really like children. They like looking after them. So they don't kill or harm the children that they abduct. So they are, I wouldn't describe them as benevolent beings, but they are morally ambivalent beings who might give you help, but certainly are not to be messed with.
So when they abduct children, do they switch them out like in European stories of changelings, or is it just a pure abduction?
No, there doesn't seem to be the changeling tradition. So no, there isn't. There's the sense that the laumes can't have children themselves, and so they envy human women for being able to have children, and so they take children, and so the classic story is that the child is found kind of being admired by the laumes by the side of a lake or a river. And eventually the laumes can be persuaded to return the child. But no, there isn't that sort of ugly changeling tradition, because the laumes generally aren't ugly beings. So no, it's not quite the same as the changeling tradition that you find in Ireland, for example.
And this justice element, you said it is similar, or it's more drastic in Lithuania?
I don't think it's necessarily more drastic. I mean, yeah, this particular story about guts being used for weaving, that seems to be distinctively Lithuanian. But certainly, yeah, the idea that the fairies are very, very keen on justice and do not like being messed around, that's something that we find throughout European folklore. And another thing to say about the Lames is that they are closely linked to another being with quite a similar name, who are the Limes. And the Limes are a bit like the Fates or the Moirai that you find in Roman and Greek mythology, or the Norns in Norse mythology. And they are three sisters of fate, three sisters who determine the beginning of life and the end of life. And the Limes, they're closely linked to the word Lime in Lithuanian. It means these beings, but it also means happiness or good fortune. And so yeah, they kind of they might appear at the birth of a child. The typical story is that the child is born and the mother and father hear three women talking outside the window, and it turns out that they're not human women. They are the Limes who are deciding the fate of that child and what that fate is supposed to be. But they also have a dark side. So, for example, they are bringers of plague. When there's a rainbow in the sky, the rainbow is known as Limes juosta in Lithuanian, which means Limes sash, and it is in fact a sign of plague. It's a sign that plague is on its way. And this had an interesting consequence in the Lithuanian community in the UK during the COVID-19 pandemic, because the rainbows were widely adopted in the UK as a symbol of hope during the pandemic. And lots of Lithuanians were looking at this and sort of laughing behind their hands, because the rainbow is a symbol of plague in Lithuania. So to put that up during a pandemic was darkly funny, I think, to Lithuanians at this time. And so yeah, Lime and Laume sometimes get confused. Sometimes they fight each other, the Limes and the Laumes, which indicates that maybe the Limes are more about the good fortune, and the Laumes are more about justice. They're more about kind of ensuring that everybody gets their just desserts. Whereas the Limes are about, some people are more fortunate than others, and the Laumes don't like that. But it's difficult to say why they have that relationship. But other times they're confused. So some, Laumes juosta, Limes juosta, depends which region of Lithuania you're in. That they might be referred to differently in relation to different beings.
And you said that they're similar to the Fates, for instance, the three sisters, the Limes. Are they? Is that similar to like a goddess?
Yes. So in the earliest references that we find to the Limes, we actually have a reference to a singular goddess, Laima. And in Latvia, that's a tradition that's preserved. So the idea that Laima is a singular goddess, a goddess of fate. And it may well be that was the original tradition. So some scholars have said that the sort of triplication that you find in Lima or Lime is a result of classical influence, or the influence of kind of learned Christian preachers who said, oh, your goddess of fate, Lima, she's like the Fates, she's like the Moirai. And then you have Lithuanians projecting onto that a later tradition of three sisters, because it's interesting that we don't find the tradition of the three sisters in Latvia, but we do in Lithuania. And you would expect that the mythology of those two countries would be cognate, that it would be very, very closely related, because they are culturally, ethnically, linguistically, very, very closely intertwined.
But you don't.
No. So it may well be that it was originally one goddess.
Interesting. That is interesting. But which one is it that is represented differently in different stories? And for instance, like the witch or hags that can shapeshift into magpies.
Yes, that's right. I think this is almost certainly a later development, so a kind of post-conversion development, and I think related possibly to witch trials. So there are various witch trials that take place in Lithuania, where, yeah, there are the words used for witch in Lithuanian. The classic word is ragana, and witchcraft is raganavimus, that thing which is done by ragana. But ragana is originally a forest goddess, and it seems that at times other goddesses are also kind of blamed for witchcraft, or are kind of identified with the kind of the archetypal witch, and one of those is the Laumes. So occasionally we do find this idea of the Laume as a kind of monstrous witch, but a non-human witch. The comparison I would make is with Baba Yaga in Slavic mythology, in that Baba Yaga is a kind of hag, a non-human witch, a monstrous witch.
And can you tell us a story, a folktale about the Lithuanian version?
Well, the one that's best known, there aren't any really kind of developed folk tales about Laume in this kind of monstrous form, but the one that's best known is the idea that she can turn herself into a magpie, or that when you see a magpie, that it is kind of Laume in disguise, and that may explain the kind of the idea of her having bird feet. But yeah, you do find these kind of debased versions of legends in which she's this kind of monstrous child stealer. But they're quite few and far between, and I think that it's quite clear this is not the original tradition. This is not the way that Laume is normally seen. It's almost like an attempt to try and make her, as maybe Christian preachers wanted her to be, as this kind of monstrous creature to be totally rejected and demonized. But no, I don't think that's really, hasn't really taken root in Lithuanian folk tradition.
So when people see magpies, are they frightened of them? Do they have an association with them?
I think these days, no. I think, yeah, by the 19th century, I think these kind of things have become emptied of any kind of threat that they might have originally had. So yeah, now it's more the sense that the magpie might be treated with reverence because it could be one of these supernatural beings in disguise, a bit like you find in Ireland, the sense that whenever you see a hare, you should treat it with respect, because it could be a witch who's transformed herself into hare form, or it could be a fairy who's transformed herself into hare form. So it's a similar kind of thing in Lithuania.
So be respectful.
Yes.
Okay. And when did these witch trials occur? Was it at the same time as the Salem witch trials that were happening in the United States, or were they happening
a little
in
bit
conjunction with the
earlier
rest of Europe?
than Salem? So Salem is 1690s, but this is happening in this, between the sort of 1620s and 1650s. So this is, there is a statute in Lithuania which prosecutes witchcraft. And there are a number of witch trials. There's nothing quite as intense as what you see in Germany. There aren't thousands of people who are put to death for witchcraft, but there is attention, directed towards people who are accused of witchcraft, and occasionally you will get folk beliefs that are mentioned as part of this. But in Lithuania, it's not as intense as it was in Latvia or Estonia, because in Latvia and Estonia, these areas are essentially under colonial control. So in Latvia and Estonia, which is then known as Livonia, you've got an aristocracy who are German or Swedish speaking. And those German and Swedish speaking aristocrats have peasants and serfs on their estates who speak Latvian and Estonian, and often are very rudimentary in their understanding of Christianity and their commitment to Christianity. And so, witchcraft accusations are very much used as a kind of a way to get those people into the church, and weaponized against those people. But the thing about Lithuania is it's not under colonial control. Your landowners, they spoke Polish, but most of them traced their ancestry and their descent to ancient Lithuanian families. So when they encounter local people believing old-fashioned things, they generally will just say, oh, well, they're just old Lithuanians. They're just the old believers. They're just a bit backward. Cut them some slack. So generally, the response is not, condemnatory or genocidal, because they belong to the same people. They're their own people. Whereas you've got this kind of colonial dynamic that's going on in Latvia and Estonia, which makes it much, much more challenging for these kind of beliefs to survive.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And so let's talk about the newborns. You said that it was a common folk tale or story for the Lumes to do the kidnapping. Is that
Yeah.
right? And you said, so talk a little bit about this. Like, is this where did this belief come from? Were there children being kidnapped frequently, or how did this folktale occur? What does the literature say?
I think that this is one situation where it does seem that folklore is fairly universal, not because there was necessarily any influence between and across cultures, but because
Mm-hmm.
something which every pre-industrial society has to deal with is the incidence of infant mortality,
Mm-hmm.
and to process that, and it seems that the changeling story, the fairy abduction story, is something which you find in the ancient world. You find a figure called Lemia, and in fact, there have even been proposals that Laume and Lemia could have some kind of etymological link, although I'm not entirely convinced by that. But Lemia is this kind of child-stealing demon that exists in the ancient world. Now, whether these were ways to hide or ways to justify infanticide, when mothers had too many children that they could take care of, and therefore they would say this one has been taken by supernatural beings, or whether this is a way to deal with the trauma of infant mortality.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know. Perhaps a bit of both. But certainly the changeling element of the story, which you find in some cultures, that also seems to be a way of dealing with disability, and with learning
Mm-hmm.
disabilities in particular, and making sense of, why is this child not like other children, and why is this child different. But that's something that doesn't seem to exist in Lithuania, interestingly enough. So that's not culturally universal. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, it does seem to be something that is found pretty much Europe wide.
But are there rituals that help to protect the children from being stolen away?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any rituals specific to Lithuania, that protect the child. But certainly, I think there are elements of Laume law which you could say are a kind of scare law, and I like this term scare law. It wasn't coined by me. It was coined by someone, but I'm not sure exactly who. Quite recently, but scare law is sort of folklore whose purpose is specifically to warn children off certain areas or to warn parents about certain dangers. And I find it interesting that Laumes are associated with disappearing children, but they're also associated with water sources. And of course, there could be a connection between disappearing children and children falling into rivers and falling into lakes and things like that. Um,
Yes.
and if you live in a very, very rural, very forested area, the chances of children getting lost in that situation are quite high. So it may well be
Mm-hmm.
that, that's another and a purpose that Laume law served.
Yes, absolutely. And then, so at one point, I think I have a quote here. The figure of Laime as the predestiner of human fate reinforced the stereotype of Lithuanians as Europe's most fatalistic people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of Lithuanian folklore is quite fatalistic. So the idea that you should accept your lot, and the likelihood is that at some point in your life you're going to experience misery, and even to the point of a view that death is sometimes preferable to life. Um, a kind of an acceptance that terrible things are probably going to happen. And I think this is informed by Lithuanian history, where terrible things have happened.
Mm-hmm.
From 1795, when you've got the final partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when Lithuania is taken over as part of the Russian Empire, and there are sustained efforts to try and stamp out Lithuanian language, Lithuanian culture, right through to the terrible events of the 20th century. I think this can be exaggerated. It can turn into a kind of national stereotype that's not very useful, because it sort of paints Lithuanians as kind of miserable and not very sunny or happy people. And of course, and every nation contains people of various different personality types and so forth. But yeah, there are certain traits of Lithuanian folklore that have. I mean, for example, there's this idea of laimedalia, and laimedalia is this idea of kind of allotted good fortune. So everyone is allotted their portion of good fortune when they're born, and if you deviate from that, then it's a kind of a crime against nature. It's like somehow you must be stealing it from someone else. So if you're happy, it must mean someone else somewhere else is miserable. And it's I suppose one way to understand that, it's a way of trying to get people to be more at ease with their miserable lot in a very unequal society, is by saying, oh, well, this is just the way that it was always meant to be. It's a similar role is played, I suppose, in certain sort of Hindu traditions by karma. So yeah, it's a little bit like that.
So would you say that they're off-put by just smiling as you're walking down the street? Like, I know that there are a lot of places where it's not really common to just kind of smile at strangers. It's not, the cultural practice. Would you say that's the case in Lithuania?
No, it's not really like I would describe Lithuania as a very hospitable country. So they have a strong culture of hospitality. Sorry. But at the same time, I think the sort of I think that some of the more kind of shallow expressions of overt happiness are not well received in Lithuania, much as they are not well received in the southern part of the UK as well. People tend not to smile at people in the street and things like that. So it's there are certain cultural norms there.
Okay. And so you were talking a little bit about the importance of water. And so are they said to live in the water or just near the water? What is the water element?
Yeah, interesting question. There are some early references that speak of them as water spirits, suggesting that maybe they did once live in the water, a bit like mermaids. But by the time that we encounter them in any kind of extended narratives, proper stories about them, by that point they're often by the water but not in it. So that there doesn't seem to be by the sort of 19th century, when we start to get proper folklore records, they don't seem to be actually in the water. And there's no sense of them as like freshwater mermaids in England, for example, and Wales. Have this penchant for kind of drawing people and luring them into the water, and sometimes luring them to their deaths and things like that. That doesn't seem to be the case at all with the Laumes, even though they are, proverbially beautiful.
And are these folklore records, are they written records, or are they oral traditions that are later on written down? Where are these records, or what are they?
So these are records that were collected, I mean, from oral sources. So when you're talking about Lithuanian folklore, there are, really sort of two main types of source. And one type of source is stuff that was written down in the early modern period by writers who were more or less interested in the question of how to convert these pagans. This is the stuff these pagans believe. How should we convert them? That sort of literature. And that's most of the literature that's in my book, Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, is very much like that, because it's the early stuff. But then by the 19th century, we start to get people like Edvardas Guzevičius, Jonas Bazanavičius, these folklore collectors who go around trying to collect the ancient stories and songs. And we don't really know to what extent these are ancient, to what extent have these been preserved for a long time. And so what you have to do is you have to kind of internally analyze this material and say what in this material sounds as though it might be a modern invention and what sounds like it might be genuinely ancient. And what there's really been in Lithuanian folklore studies, reflecting, folklore studies across Europe, is a shift away from a quite credulous approach to what is ancient, saying, oh, this must be ancient. Let's assume this is ancient unless we have good reason to think it's not, to a more skeptical approach. So today it tends to be that, you try and find an explanation through comparison with stuff collected at a similar time to see whether this is something that's just kind of, in popular culture at the time, and therefore it's not really ancient. Or if you find something that's really, really weird and inexplicable, then it might possibly be an example of something that has survived and is genuinely ancient. Probably the most famous example of stuff that is genuinely considered to be ancient even today are the dinas. And these are actually not Lithuanian, they're Latvian. They're a collection of songs collected mainly in the 19th century. And the Latvian dinas, they're so enigmatic. Some of them are clearly of more modern invention, but others seem to kind of embody this kind of strange kind of mythological material. But the trouble is, it's kind of becomes separated from its original context. So you have kind of mentions of gods and things that are happening in the divine realm, with these gods kind of interacting with each other, but the narratives are kind of incomplete. So it's almost as though you've got a series of elusive songs about a whole body of mythological material, but we don't have that body of mythological material at all. So it's like someone is singing a song about something that Achilles did, but we've lost the Iliad. It's just that sort of thing. We don't have the original kind of narrative that was underpinning this stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a shame. I feel like maybe there's a tome out there waiting to be found to like tie all this together to make it make sense.
Yeah,
are people looking for something like that?
Yeah, but I think, the problem that we have with most Northern European mythology, I mean, there are exceptions like the Eddas, the Norse Eddas, which are these massive kind of narrative material. But most of the time, apart from things like the Norse Eddas and the Irish material and the Welsh material, you've mostly just got tiny fragments referencing stories that are now lost. It's the same thing in Anglo-Saxon England. You've got kind of references to Woden and references to Wayland, and but we don't know what the stories were that these references refer to. And it's the same in Lithuania. It's the same in Slavic mythology. We just don't have, in most cases, the full stories.
Yeah, that's such a shame. But you also said, so going back to our limes and laume, there's a sacredness of snakes. How does that tie in?
Yeah, well, the thing that comes back again and again in early modern accounts of Lithuanian religion is that there are three things the Lithuanians hold most sacred, and those things are fire, trees, and snakes. And the explanation that's given for the snake cult is that there are certain festivals of the year when snakes are effectively tamed so that they will come to the table and they will eat food that's offered to them. And this in itself is a kind of divinatory rite, because if the snakes like your food and eat it, then things are going to go well for you. And if they don't, if they refuse to eat your food and slither off again back into the forest, things are going to go badly for you. Now, there are also myths that are connected to the snakes. The most famous one is the story Egle, Queen of Serpents, which is about a kind of serpent, a serpent kingdom that's under a lake, where a girl called Egle goes to marry the king of serpents. Now, it's unclear to what extent that myth is really genuinely ancient, but it does seem to be the case that Lithuanians worshipped snakes, or at least that they venerated snakes. Now, that makes sense because, lots of evidence within Indo-European tradition of sacred snakes, because snakes are a universal symbol across many cultures of new life, because they can change their skins. So the snake becomes an emblem of immortality, an emblem of healing, most famously probably to the ancient Greeks. The god Asclepius has a caduceus with a serpent coiled around it. He's the god of healing. And that's because the snake is a symbol of healing. And you find that to this day, on ambulances and hospitals, the snake is a symbol of healing, which, long predates the negative associations that were given to the snake by the Old Testament. So yeah, that kind of makes sense and it adds up. So yeah, there does seem to have been some kind of snake cult, but we don't truly understand what Lithuanians believed about it. We don't know whether they thought that the snakes were holy animals, whether they thought that they were gods in snake form. We don't know whether they thought that they were like the spirits of the dead, maybe, that came in the form of snake. We don't know that kind of content, and that's always the frustration.
And so are there still these festivals today around snakes, or do they no longer happen?
I mean, that's something which Christianity kind of stamped out, because I think when it came to snakes, Christianity comes into conflict with, with these older Indo-European traditions to such an extent that, the culturally the snake is to be rejected and is considered this symbol of evil. So I'm not aware of any examples in modern Lithuania where snakes are treated with particular reverence.
And so you mentioned how a lot of these stories are part of the scare lore to try and keep children from doing certain things, and it seems like a lot of the stories were quite gruesome and scary. Is that right?
Yeah, so you'll find a kind of a fair share of scary stories in Lithuanian folklore. I mean, there are kind of evil beings who you're supposed to be wary of, or perhaps not beings who are kind of universally and totally evil. They're quite rare, actually. There's a figure called Velnias. Velnias is the sort of the straightforward Lithuanian translation is devil, but that doesn't really do justice to who Velnias is. He's not really the devil. He comes to stand in for the Christian devil because he's the closest that Lithuania's got to the Christian devil. But he's more of a trickster god. But he's also a kind of a psychopomp. He's a kind of shepherd of the souls of the dead. And he can be benevolent. He can stand up for the persecuted, as well as being, somebody who can really kind of, cause trouble for you. So yeah, he's a little dark figure, but not an entirely negative figure. And similarly, there's you've got a figure called Edvaras. And Edvaras is a kind of domestic spirit, a little bit like the cockatrice, because he hatches from a hen's egg, but is a kind of fire spirit who can be very helpful around the home. But if you reject him or try to get rid of him, then he can cause you real problems and sort of cause illnesses and cause your house to burn down and things like that. So yeah, again, sort of there's a price to be paid, and I think this is something that we find a lot in across European folklore. Yes, you can make kind of deals with these spirits and you can gain things from them, but there's a price to be paid. So it's like, there's a flip side to every coin. And I think it's quite rare in folklore, in folklore proper, kind of, things that genuinely do come from the rural folk, to find the concept of absolute evil, because absolute evil is really a theological concept. That's confined to learned discussion or kind of modern horror films. In folk culture, things tend not to be absolutely evil, because that's not very narratively satisfying. How can you tell a story about someone or something which is absolutely evil? Because you either have to defeat it or it defeats you. Whereas if you can tell a story about beings who have more of an ambivalence to them, then there are deals to be made, and there are agreements to be struck, and a relationship to be created. So yeah, the question of evil is an interesting one in Lithuanian folklore.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it. And you talked a little bit about the etymology of the words, the Laime and the Laume. Can you speak a little bit about that and why it's important to figure out what they where they came from, and if they have an actual relationship from a root word, and why linguists are interested in this topic?
Well, when it comes to Laime, it's pretty clear where the connection is with with the concept of Laime, of joy or good fortune. I think when it comes to Laume, it's much more obscure exactly what that etymology is, and there's various proposals have been put forward, including that connection with Lamia, the child stealing demon in ancient Greece and Rome. But I think the answer with Laume is nobody really knows, what the origin is. But again, as with Lima, the goddess Lima, who might kind of triplicate into these three goddesses of fortune or fate, there's a question about Laumes, about whether there was once a Lauma, whether there was once a kind of a singular being, and that being became duplicated into all these other beings, into a class of beings. But I'm a bit skeptical of that, because something which I've observed, I wrote a book which came out earlier this year called Twilight of the Godlings, which is looking at supernatural beings in Britain. And the conclusion I came to there is that sometimes you can't be too hard and fast about singular and plural when it comes to supernatural beings. So, take, for example, a being in Roman mythology like Faunus. We tend to think not of Faunus, we tend to think of fauns. We tend to think of fauns as a class of being, these kind of nature spirits who have animal characteristics and human characteristics. We tend not to think of Faunus as a singular god, and yet Faunus was a singular god. But I don't think we should see these things as separate developments. They could be part of the same idea, the idea that a deity, one of the things that makes deities supernatural, one of the things that makes deities strange and different from us, is that they do not have a pinned down individuality as a singular being. They might exist as a plurality of beings. And sometimes, of course, you'll find deities who exist as a plurality of genders as well as a plurality of beings. So, yeah, it's this kind of strangeness of the divine that I don't think we should necessarily see them as once there was one goddess and now there are many different, many nature spirits. It might be there were always both.
Interesting. Yeah. So that is super fascinating. Why do you feel like this work is important?
I consider it very important to introduce Lithuania and the folklore of Lithuania to the English-speaking world. There's a huge amount of work that is being done all the time on Lithuanian mythology, Lithuanian folklore, primarily by Lithuanians writing in Lithuanian, which is great. But it means that there's quite a limited audience for that stuff. And I do believe that Lithuania is of broader significance than just to Lithuanians or just people in Eastern Europe, because of this unique position that it holds as one of the very last bastions of European paganism. So if we really want to understand these questions about the survival of paganism or the endurance of paganism, if we study what was the last country to abandon these pagan practices, then we learn a great deal about how paganism transfers to folklore and how it happens. Because if we're always studying cultures where it happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, if for example, we keep focusing on a country like Ireland, which became Christianized probably by the 6th or at the very latest the 7th century, then this is a long time ago that this happened. And so we have to ask ourselves how much of this really survives. But if we actually turn to look at countries where it happened much more recently, then it's almost as though we have a control against which we can then compare other countries. So that's one reason why Lithuania really matters to me. And I think that it's interesting also because of its status as this kind of enclave of archaic Indo-European language, which does raise this question of has Lithuania preserved aspects of Indo-European culture that are archaic? And if that's true, then they kind of lie at the root of other mythologies. They have something to say about any mythology of any country that is a place where Indo-European languages are spoken. I'm a bit skeptical about whether that really is true, but we need to test it, and we need to know whether that really is the case. So yeah, I think that Lithuania is a very fertile field for exploration, and there are some absolutely brilliant folklorists who have studied this stuff. Trouble is that most people can't read Lithuanian, and therefore they can't access this material. So yeah, I'm a bit plowing a lonely furrow in that regard.
So when you so your Lithuanian is very good, or do you do all the translations yourself, or do you have someone helping you?
It's not very good. So I can read Lithuanian to the level where I can kind of make sense of roughly what's going on. I do have a translator who helps me with stuff. So yeah, I do receive help with that. But yeah, I've got the basics. And I'm not totally at sea, but no, my Lithuanian is not certainly nowhere near as strong as I'd like it to be.
And what impact do you want your books to have on the world?
Well, I would love people to become more aware of Lithuania and its history, and to become aware of how important it was. In terms of this was a huge country that was very, very culturally influential and very important in the region. And I don't see why we should always be looking at the same countries in Europe and constantly putting the emphasis on Western Europe. And I think we need to kind of broaden our horizons, really. So that's
diversify. It does make it a lot easier when it's in the right language for a lot of the speakers. But I agree. I would love to see a lot more diversity from different countries, but that will require a lot more translation work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are Lithuanian scholars who are writing in English about this stuff. But again, their work doesn't tend to make much of an impact because it's published in Lithuania by Lithuanian publishers. So unless people seek it out, they're maybe not going to read this. And I think that there is a kind of ingrained prejudice as well against Eastern Europe as somehow not mattering. And I think that's something that we need to really overcome. And yeah, I think also a long tradition of there are certain countries, when you're a folklorist, there are certain countries that have this privileged status for no apparent reason. But really, I suppose that the reason is that that's where folklore studies in the modern sense began. Ireland, Britain, France, Germany with the Brothers Grimm, Scandinavia. They sort of have this privileged status, and so most folklore scholarship seems to focus on those countries. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a wealth of material to be studied elsewhere. And sure, there's more work to be done on British folklore or whatever. But there's also, these kind of almost unexplored countries, unexplored territories. Why don't we, just for a change, take a look at those?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the goals, like I said, when we were corresponding, is I would really like this podcast to be able to cover every single one of the countries in the world. So that is an overarching goal of the podcast. So for any listener who's out there who has a specific country that they have a connection to, a folklorist or someone who can talk about that, please let me know, because that is something that I also feel strongly about. Because you're right, when we look at folklore, I am again and again pointed to Ireland and England. And although I absolutely love that folklore, it's part of what I grew up hearing about, and it's very fascinating, I also want to hear about other places in the world, because part of the reason we're doing this podcast is to broaden our horizons, to broaden our view of different cultures. And the way we do that is by really leaning into finding that diversity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, hopefully that's Lithuania ticked off your list.
Yeah. Well, I might not be through with Lithuania. I mean, we can come back to different countries and, find different elements. And that's the beauty of folklore, because there's so many, there's one interesting thing here. We just really covered Laime and Laume, but I'm sure there's so many more interesting elements to Lithuania as well that could be delved into. So But thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a really fascinating episode.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Folklorists, for hanging with us today as we talked about the Lithuanian supernatural. All the links that we talked about today will be at our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. And so we'll list the 2 books that he mentioned, and then some of the other things that we talked about as well should be on there as well. Possibly that Ramavo festival that you spoke about. That sounded really interesting. And if you had any questions about today's podcast, or if you had thoughts about Lithuanian folklore, or something that really piqued your interest, we have a community page. It's a Facebook community page, Fabric of Folklore Community, and that's where we really encourage our audience members to engage with us. We want to hear from you. We want to know what your thoughts are, and we want to know what you want to hear about. So that's where we really encourage you to start conversations about what we've talked about on our episode. What did you know about Lithuanian folklore before this podcast, and what surprised you in this episode? So, if you enjoy this podcast, make sure you're subscribing so you're getting those notifications, whether that's on YouTube or we're on all of the streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all of the typical ones. Make sure you're sharing and liking because when you do that, it really helps a new podcast like ours, because it helps other people to find our podcast. When you review, when you rate it, that's how new listeners can find us. So make sure you're liking, commenting, engaging, reviewing. Those are all wonderful things that you can help our podcast to rise to the top so others can find us. Thanks once again for listening to us unravel the mysteries of folklore. And until next time, keep the folk alive.